On January the 31st, 1968, the people of Saigon in South Vietnam were celebrating their New Year festival called Tet. Suddenly, savage fighting broke out. It was the beginning of a nationwide communist assault that would change the course of the long-running Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive was to be a turning point in a war that would eventually see this city and the whole of Vietnam united under communist rule. A war that would rage for more than a decade and that would in the end see America, one of the world's superpowers, suffer perhaps its greatest setback of the 20th century. I'll be explaining how the best equipped army in the world had to adapt its strategy to face a largely guerrilla fighting force.
The American troops had to get used to this new kind of combat in a strange country far away from home.
I'll be experiencing a little of what it was like for them as they fought their way through the towns and cities of South Vietnam. I'll also be telling the story of the communist fighters who staged this bold attack on the world's mightiest military power.
In the whole of this long war, it was the Tet Offensive of 1968 that was the pivotal moment. Fought here in the streets of Vietnam, it struck right at the very core of the American psyche. The Tet Offensive was one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century. Since 1965, the Americans had been fighting the communist regime in North Vietnam. The West was gripped by a fear of communism, devouring country after country. And the Americans believed that if they didn't make a decisive stand in Vietnam, the whole of Southeast Asia would fall.
By 1967, hundreds of thousands of American troops had poured into South Vietnam. Many were stationed in remote areas like this hillside called Con Thien. Con Thien was at the sharp end of the war in Vietnam. The fight against the communists had become so fierce that the Marines based here called it the meat grinder.
During the war, there would have been artillery here, both in this bunker and dug in on the hillside. Most of it would have pointed that way, because just over there was a border that cut Vietnam in two. On this side, the Republic of South Vietnam, which the Americans were here to protect. And on the far side, the Communist North.
The fire base here at Con Thien was in the front line of America's war against communism, to prevent the Communist North taking over the South. Con Thien was one of a chain of US artillery bases just south of the border. Here's the base right here. And here's the border, with a kind of no man's land either side of it called the Demilitarized Zone. The Demilitarized Zone literally cut Vietnam in half. Down here was South Vietnam, a fragile republic governed by a military elite whose army needed America's help. Their capital was Saigon. The whole of Vietnam, north and south, is 1,000 miles from bottom to top. Up here, communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China. And leading it, in its capital Hanoi, the lifelong communist and ardent nationalist Ho Chi Minh. Known as Uncle Ho to his followers, Ho Chi Minh had trained and equipped an army of 500,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. Ho had successfully driven out the French colonial government in 1954, and now he was resolved to push out the Americans and reunite Vietnam under communism. The Americans were led by General William Westmoreland. With a clutch of medals from World War II and Korea, Westmoreland now led an American force of 500,000 troops in support of some 800,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. But the challenge faced by General Westmoreland and his men was all the greater because they didn't just have one enemy, they had two. As well as a threat from the north, the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies had to face thousands of local communist guerrillas here inside South Vietnam itself.
The Southern Communist rebels called themselves the National Liberation Front, but history remembers them by the name the Americans used, the Viet Cong, or VC.
They were a huge problem for the US troops. With no uniforms to distinguish them from the other villagers in South Vietnam, it was very difficult to tell who was friend and who was foe.
You VC? Yeah, you Viet Cong, huh? You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong. I'm in Viet. You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong.
Half the time, the Americans were fighting an enemy they just couldn't pin down.
But the Viet Cong's ability to blend in was not their only advantage. They were also supplied by their powerful ally and effective controller in the north, Ho Chi Minh. The lifeline he set up to supply the Viet Cong was an incredible logistical feat. He sent North Vietnamese fighters, arms and equipment down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of unpaved roads and paths stretching hundreds of miles down the length of Vietnam. It was largely concealed in the jungle, just across the border in supposedly neutral countries next door.
I traveled south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail twice. We literally had to hack or crawl our way through the jungle. Some people would carry up to 80 kilos on their shoulders. There were even some hill tribes people who would carry up to 90 kilos, which for the women was more than their own body weight.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was vital to the communist war effort. And the weapon the United States deployed against it was the might of its air power. Some of the bombing targets were strategic points in North Vietnam, railways, bridges, factories and so on. Another target for the bombers, including giant B-52s, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans hoped their bombing would cut off the lifeblood of the rebels in the south. Just one of these B-52s could drop over 100 bombs and devastate an area a mile long by a quarter of a mile wide. In South Vietnam, the bombers would act on intelligence reports and try to hit Viet Cong strongholds. High explosive bombs and napalm, an extremely flammable liquid, caused terrible destruction. And much of the countryside, on which so many depended, was laid to waste.
These bombs may have been hitting their targets, but they weren't doing much to win over the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. Often, the targets were in or near populated villages, so inevitably, civilians were killed.
It also wasn't really a very good way of rooting out the communists. To do that, there was really no alternative but to go in on foot.
The South Vietnamese army and the Americans spent days patrolling the countryside, trying to hunt down the Viet Cong and looking for telltale signs that